A boy is strapped into a roaring aircraft, the sky shaking like it wants to tear him apart. In a few minutes he will be on fire, falling, and the only thing between him and death will be a split-second decision. Now cut to a different scene. The same man, decades later, standing in the cold light of Parliament, about to be torn apart again. This time not by flak, but by his own side. John Gorton's life is a story of surviving impacts, and then choosing again and again to walk back into the blast zone. He was born on 9th of September 1911 in Melbourne, into a world that still believed the British Empire was the natural order of things, and that a proper life followed a straight line. Gorton's line never did. His father, John Rose Gorton, worked as a public servant. His mother, Alice Sin, carried the quiet weight of a household that expected discipline and respectability. The young John grew up with the clipped manners of middle-class Australia, but there was always something in him that didn't sit still, an impatience with being told where his limits were. At Geelong College, he was bright, competitive, and restless. He could charm, argue, and provoke in the same breath. He wasn't the kind of boy who simply absorbed rules. He tested them, pushed them, sometimes broke them just to hear the sound. That streak would later make him dangerous in politics because it made him hard to control. But first it made him hard to contain. He went on to the University of Melbourne, studying arts, then law. The law, with its neat logic and tidy conclusions, should have suited him. Instead, it became another arena where he learned how power really worked, not just through statutes, but through confidence, networks, party, and the ability to speak as if you belonged in the room. He was called to the Victorian bar, but he never looked like a man who would spend his life politely waiting for briefs. He wanted motion, he wanted stakes. In 1935, he married Bettina Brown, known as Betty, and for a moment his life seemed to settle into the shape expected of him. A young, professional, a family man, a future mapped out in respectable increments. But history was loading the next scene, and it would not ask his permission. When the Second World War arrived, it didn't just change Australia's politics, it changed the temperature of the entire world. Gorton joined the Royal Australian Air Force. He trained as a pilot, and in the cockpit he found something that matched his temperament: speed, risk, consequence. Flying wasn't a job, it was a kind of truth. Up there, you couldn't bluff your way out of physics. He flew with number 77 Squadron and later served in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The war was not the clean, heroic montage people like to imagine. It was metal and smoke and the sudden, obscene violence of machines colliding with flesh. And then came the moment that would mark him forever. In 1944, during operations in the region, Gorton's aircraft was hit. The details of such incidents can sound clinical on paper. Shot down, crash-landed, but the reality is a nightmare of seconds. A cockpit becomes an oven. The air becomes poison. The ground rises like a wall. Gorton survived, but not unscarred. He suffered severe facial burns. The damage was permanent, visible, and impossible to hide. He would carry it into every room for the rest of his life, a reminder that he had already paid a price most people only talk about. And here's the brutal twist: survival didn't end the danger. After being rescued, he was involved in another crash, this time during a takeoff in a transport aircraft. Again, the world flipped. Again, the body took the hit. It was as if fate kept testing whether he would finally decide he'd had enough. He didn't. He returned to duty. That stubbornness, some would call it courage, others recklessness, became his signature. When the war ended, Australia was full of men trying to return to normal life with abnormal memories. Gorton came home with a face that made strangers stare, and a mind that had learned, in the hardest possible way, that tomorrow was never guaranteed. He went back to law, but the courtroom must have felt too small after the sky. He tried business, including involvement in the family's orchard interests. Yet even there, he was not simply rebuilding, he was searching. The war had given him a kind of authority that didn't come from titles. It came from having been tested. Politics in post-war Australia was also being tested. The country was shifting, economically, socially, strategically. The old certainties were cracking. The Liberal Party had formed in the 1940s, and the conservative side of politics was reorganizing itself for a new era. Gorton was drawn to it, not as a quiet backbencher type, but as a man who believed leadership should be decisive and national in scale. He entered the political arena through the Senate, winning election for Victoria in 1949 as a Liberal. It was a significant year. Robert Menzies returned to power, beginning a long period of conservative government. In Canberra, the Senate could be a place where careers went to slow down. For Gorton, it became a launch pad. He was not content to be a background figure. He spoke with a bluntness that could cut through the fog of parliamentary language. He had the confidence of someone who had already faced death and found it unimpressed by rhetoric. But Canberra is not a cockpit. In the air, the enemy is visible. The rules are brutal, and the outcomes are immediate. In politics, the enemy can be sitting beside you, smiling. The rules are unwritten. The outcomes can take years, and then arrive all at once like a delayed explosion. Gorton's early years in Parliament were shaped by two forces pulling in opposite directions. One was his ambition, which was real and unapologetic. The other was the party machine, which preferred predictability and loyalty. He was loyal to the liberal cause, but not always to liberal comfort. He could be charming, but he could also be abrasive. He didn't always soften his edges for the sake of harmony. That made him both valuable and threatening. He began to climb. In 1958, he became minister in charge of the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CSIRO, an appointment that hinted at something important about him. He was interested in national capability, in the machinery of modern power. Science, research, industry, these were not glamorous portfolios, but they were the bones of a country that wanted to stand on its own feet. He later served as Minister for the Navy in 1963, and then as Minister for Education and Science in 1964. Each role added another layer to his understanding of how Australia worked, and how it could be made to work differently. Yet even as he rose, the tension around him rose too. Gorton was not a man who blended into the wallpaper. His war injuries made him physically distinctive, but it was his personality that truly set him apart. He had a habit of speaking as if he were already in charge. Some colleagues admired it, others resented it. In a party that valued order, he carried the scent of disruption. Then came 1966, and with it a sudden acceleration. Harold Holt became Prime Minister after Menzies retired, and Holt brought Gorton into the inner circle as Minister for Works. Then, quickly as Minister for Education and Science again, and then, most crucially, Gorton became leader of the government in the Senate. That position mattered. It put him at the center of parliamentary management, strategy, and the daily grind of keeping a government moving. It also put him in the line of sight of every ambitious rival. And rivals were forming. In politics, people rarely announce themselves as enemies. They become concerned colleagues. They whisper about style and judgment. They talk about unity while counting numbers. Gorton, with his independence and his refusal to be easily managed, was the kind of man who made others start doing arithmetic. Still, he had something they couldn't manufacture. A story that felt like Australia's own myth of toughness and survival. A pilot burned in war, a man who came back and kept going. In a country that valued resilience, he looked like resilience made flesh. That gave him a public strength that unsettled private schemers. Then late in 1967, history struck with a shock so strange it felt unreal. Harold Holt disappeared while swimming at Cheviot Beach. One moment Australia had a prime minister, the next it had a mystery. The sea swallowed certainty. The nation watched the headlines with a kind of stunned disbelief, as if the modern world had suddenly reverted to ancient tragedy. In the vacuum, the Liberal Party had to choose a new leader. And now the stakes were no longer theoretical. This was not about a future promotion. This was about who would take control of a country in the middle of the Cold War, in the shadow of Vietnam, with alliances, budgets, and lives on the line. Gorton was in the Senate, an unusual place for a prime minister to come from. The House of Representatives was where leaders traditionally sat, where the daily combat of question time happened, where legitimacy was performed in front of cameras and crowds. For Gorton, that meant a ticking clock the moment his name entered the conversation. If he wanted the top job, he would have to do something rare and risky. Leap from the Senate to the House, or risk being seen as a leader without a proper battlefield. And the party was split between those who wanted continuity and those who wanted control. Some saw Gorton as a war hero with national appeal. Others saw him as a man who might not take instructions. The tension tightened like a wire. The decision would not just pick a prime minister. It would decide what kind of Liberal Party Australia would get. Obedient and cautious. Or bold and unpredictable. In those days, leadership ballots were not public theater. They were internal storms. Deals were made in corridors. Promises were implied rather than spoken. And Gorton, with his scars and his stubbornness, stood at the center of it, knowing that if he reached for power, he would have to fight not only the opposition across the chamber, but the quiet resistance within his own ranks. The countdown had begun. The country was still staring at the ocean, still trying to understand how a prime minister could simply vanish. Harold Holt's disappearance didn't just leave a vacancy. It left a psychological wound, proof that even the highest office could be erased in an instant. And in that stunned silence, the Liberal Party had to do something brutal and immediate. Pick a new leader before the nation's confidence bled out. For John Gorton, the moment came with a built-in trap. He was leader of the government in the Senate. Powerful, visible, but in the wrong chamber. In Australian politics, the House of Representatives is the arena where prime ministers are expected to fight. The Senate is where careers can look impressive and still be treated as second tier. So the question hanging over him wasn't only can he lead, it was can he even stand where a leader is supposed to stand? And there was a clock ticking that had nothing to do with romance or destiny and everything to do with procedure and perception. If Gorton took the leadership, he would have to get into the House fast. Fast enough to look legitimate, fast enough to stop rivals from calling him an accident of panic. He couldn't drift. He couldn't hesitate. He had to move like a pilot who knows the engine is failing and the runway is running out. Inside the party room, the atmosphere was not grief. It was arithmetic. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in public were suddenly measuring each other in private, counting numbers, testing loyalties. William McMahon, the ambitious treasurer with a reputation for relentless maneuvering, was there, always there, like a shadow that never quite left the edge of the frame. Others, too, watched Gorton with a particular kind of suspicion. Not the suspicion that he was weak, but that he was uncontrollable. Because Gorton didn't behave like a man who needed permission. He had the scars of war on his face and the war's impatience in his voice. He spoke plainly. He could be charming, then abruptly blunt. He didn't always flatter colleagues. He didn't always consult. In a party that prized discipline, he carried the dangerous scent of independence. Yet that same independence was exactly what made him attractive in the crisis. Australia didn't want a caretaker who looked like he'd been selected by committee. It wanted someone who could fill the empty space Holt had left with something solid. Someone who looked like he could take a hit and keep standing. Gorton looked like that because he had done it, literally, in fire. The leadership ballot came quickly. The party chose him. And in that instant, the strange became real. A senator was now Prime Minister of Australia. It was constitutional, it was legal, and it was politically unstable, like building a house on a platform that everyone insists is temporary. So Gorton did the only thing he could do. He engineered his own escape from the Senate. A safe Liberal seat in the House of Representatives, Higgins, was open for him. The plan was simple on paper and ruthless in practice. Resign from the Senate, win a by-election, and reappear in the House as if the whole thing had been inevitable. But until that by-election was won, he was a prime minister with an asterisk beside his name. Every day before he entered the House was a day his enemies could whisper, "He's not really one of us." Sri a Dawanman. He resigned from the Senate. That resignation was more than a formality. It was a leap. If he lost the by-election, he wouldn't just lose a seat. He would become a national embarrassment, a leader who fell through the floor. The pressure was immediate and personal. His authority depended on a single electorate's vote. He won. And when he walked into the House of Representatives, it wasn't just a change of chamber. It was a change of battlefield. Now he had to face question time, the cameras, the daily combat that turned small mistakes into headlines. Now he had to prove that the party hadn't chosen a romantic war story over a functioning prime minister. But the real fight wasn't across the aisle. It was behind him. Gorton's first months were a balancing act between two forces that hated each other. On one side was the Liberal Party's traditional caution, its instinct to keep Canberra's machinery humming without frightening the public or upsetting the internal hierarchy. On the other side was Gorton's own instinct to centralize decision-making, to push national development, to act like the Commonwealth. Government should be a driver, not a bookkeeper. He began to reshape the government's tone. He talked about Australia as something more than a loyal outpost of Britain. He leaned into the idea of national capability, industry, science, infrastructure, defense production. He wanted Australia to stand taller in its own region, not just as an echo of London or Washington. To some Australians, it sounded like confidence. To some Liberals, it sounded like heresy. And then there was Vietnam, an issue that could tear a government apart without firing a single shot in Parliament. Australia's commitment was already in place, tied tightly to the alliance with the United States. The war was escalating, and so was public anger. Protest was becoming a force you could feel in the streets, not just read about in editorials. Gorton inherited the conflict like a live grenade, with the pin already half out. He didn't have the luxury of starting fresh. He had to manage a war, a party, and a country still haunted by Holt's disappearance. And he had to do it while being watched by colleagues who were waiting for him to stumble. The first real test came in 1969, a federal election. It was supposed to be routine, another victory for a government that had been in power since 1949. Instead, it turned into a warning shot. The coalition held on, but with a sharply reduced majority. The message was clear. The public was not guaranteed. The era of automatic liberal dominance was cracking. Inside the party, that result didn't read as, "We survived." It read as, "He's vulnerable." From that moment, the knives didn't come out all at once. They came out as murmurs, as briefings, as concerns. Gorton's style became the story. His centralizing instincts were described as arrogance. His bluntness was described as recklessness. His willingness to challenge orthodoxies, especially on defense procurement and national development, was described as dangerous. And the most poisonous part was that some of the criticism wasn't about policy at all. It was about personality, about whether he fit. In politics, fit is often code for obedience. Gorton didn't do obedience gracefully. He also had a complicated relationship with the country party, the coalition partner that could make or break a liberal prime minister. John McEwen, the country party leader, was a formidable force, protector of rural interests, master of leverage. McEwen had already shown his power after Holt vanished by effectively blocking William McMahon from becoming prime minister. That single act had reshaped the succession and helped open the path for Gorton. But it also meant Gorton's position was tied to a coalition relationship that could turn cold fast. So Gorton governed with a constant awareness that his support was conditional. Not just conditional on the electorate, but conditional on the internal weather of his own side. And then came the moment that turned internal tension into open war. The slow, grinding collapse of trust between Gorton and senior colleagues, especially his deputy, William McMahon. McMahon was not a man who waited patiently for history. He was a man who worked at it day after day, phone call after phone call, building a case that Gorton was a risk the party could no longer afford. The conflict wasn't theatrical. It was worse than theatrical. It was bureaucratic, procedural, plausible. It was the kind of conflict that can destroy a leader because it looks from the outside like responsible concern. But inside, it feels like suffocation. Gorton's response was not to retreat. It was to push harder, to act more decisively, to tighten control, to rely on a smaller circle. That, in turn, fed the narrative that he was isolated. The more he tried to steer the ship through rough water, the more his own crew whispered that he was steering alone. By 1970 and into 1971, the pressure had become a constant hum. Every decision was interpreted as evidence. Every misstep was amplified. The party room was no longer a team. It was a room full of men imagining different futures, and some of them imagined those futures without John Gorton in them. Then the crisis finally broke the surface. A leadership spill was triggered, an internal vote that would decide whether he stayed prime minister. It was the political equivalent of being told, mid-flight, that the crew is voting on whether you should still be in the cockpit, and the numbers came back like a punch. The vote was tied. In most stories, a tie is a reprieve. In Gorton's story, it was a death sentence. A tied vote meant half his own party wanted him gone. Half, not a fringe, not a few malcontents. Half the men who were supposed to stand behind him. He could have clung on. He could have used procedure, delayed, bargained, threatened. But Gorton had always carried a pilot's sense of reality. When the aircraft is compromised, you don't argue with the instruments. You act. He cast the deciding vote against himself. It was one of the most startling acts of political self-destruction in Australian history. Except it wasn't self-destruction in his mind. It was control. If he was going to fall, he would choose the moment and the manner. He would not be dragged out like a casualty. He would step out like a man who refuses to beg. And just like that, the prime minister who had survived fire in the sky was brought down by something colder, the quiet, relentless pressure of his own side. William McMahon became prime minister. The party machine exhaled. The newspapers wrote their analyses. Canberra moved on with its usual speed, as if a man's rise and fall were just another item on the agenda. But Gorton didn't disappear. Not yet. In a final twist that stunned colleagues and made the internal wounds bleed again, McMahon appointed him Minister for Defense. Imagine it. The deposed leader, now sitting at the cabinet table under the man who had helped replace him, responsible for the most sensitive portfolio in a country still entangled in Vietnam and Cold War strategy. It was either an attempt at unity or a way to keep a dangerous figure close, where he could be watched. For Gorton, it was a new kind of countdown. Not the countdown to win a by-election, not the countdown to survive a leadership vote, but the countdown of a man who knows he is surrounded by people who would prefer him to be silent. Defense meant secrets, decisions, alliances, power. And power in the hands of a man who refused to be managed was exactly what his enemies feared. The blast zone hadn't vanished. It had simply moved. The defense portfolio looks clean on paper. Briefings, budgets, bases, alliances. But in 1971, it was a room full of live wires. Vietnam was still burning. The Cold War still dictated the language of necessity. And inside Canberra, John Gorton was now expected to serve loyally under William McMahon, the man whose ascent had been greased by the very doubts that had toppled him. It was like asking a fallen commander to salute the officer who'd taken his chair, then hand him the map. Gorton walked into defense with the same scarred face and the same refusal to be domesticated. He had never been a natural subordinate. He had been a pilot, a man trained to make decisions when the cockpit is shaking and the horizon is wrong. Now he was being told to keep his hands off the controls. The first thing that hit him was the machinery, the department, the services, the procurement pipelines, the alliance expectations. Defense is where governments spend fortunes in the dark, where a single contract can lock a country into decades of dependency. Gorton had always believed Australia should build more of its own capability, its own industry, its own technology, its own muscle. That instinct didn't vanish when he lost the prime ministership. If anything, it sharpened, because now he could see from the inside how easily national security could become a polite excuse for inertia. He pushed for Australian defense production and for a more self-reliant posture. Ideas that sounded patriotic to the public and sounded like trouble to the cautious men around him. The services had their preferences. The bureaucracy had its habits. The Americans had their expectations. And McMahon had his own political survival to manage. Gorton's presence in defense wasn't just inconvenient, it was unpredictable. He could speak with authority, and he could speak without permission. And then came the pressure that never shows up in official histories, the pressure of being watched. Every move he made was interpreted through the lens of the leadership war. If he argued hard in cabinet, it wasn't a minister doing his job. It was Gorton undermining McMahon. If he held back, it wasn't discipline. It was Gorton sulking. There was no safe posture. The room had decided what he was, and now it hunted for evidence. The countdown for him was simple and brutal. How long could he stay inside a government that wanted his competence but feared his independence? How long before the tension snapped into something public? It snapped faster than anyone expected. In 1971, not long after taking defense, Gorton resigned from the ministry. The official reasons were wrapped in the usual language: differences, disagreements, principle. But the real meaning was unmistakable. He would not be managed. He would not sit at the table as a decorative trophy of unity while decisions were made around him. He walked out rather than be slowly erased. And that resignation wasn't the end of the fight. It was the fight changing shape. Because Gorton, now on the backbench, still had a weapon that terrifies governments. A voice that can't be whipped into silence. He had been prime minister. He knew where the bodies were buried, not in the melodramatic sense, but in the practical sense. He understood the compromises, the deals, the pressures. He could speak with the authority of someone who had held the wheel, and he could do it without needing anyone's approval. McMahon's government, meanwhile, was heading into a storm that wasn't just political, it was cultural. Australia was changing. The old post-war consensus was cracking. The streets were louder. The universities were angrier. The Vietnam War had become a moral argument, not just a strategic one. Conscription, sending young men to fight by lottery, was no longer a policy detail. It was a national wound you could point to. Gorton had inherited Vietnam as prime minister and managed it with the constraints of alliance and party. Now outside the ministry, he could look at the same war with fewer shackles. He wasn't suddenly a radical, but he was never comfortable with blind obedience. He had always been more nationalist than ideologue, more interested in what Australia should be than in what the party machine wanted it to say. And as the coalition's grip loosened, Gorton's earlier instincts, national development, cultural confidence, a more independent Australia, began to look less like heresy and more like a preview of where the country was heading. That's the twist people miss. Gorton's problem inside the Liberal Party was that he was too early, too willing to talk about Australia as something separate from Britain, too willing to use federal power to build national capacity, too willing to treat culture and science as serious instruments of nationhood rather than luxuries. Even while he was being undermined, his government had pushed through changes that quietly rewired the country's self-image. Under Gorton, the Commonwealth expanded support for the arts, most famously through the establishment of the Australian Council for the Arts. It's easy to say arts funding and imagine polite galleries and grant applications. But in the late 1960s, it was a statement. Australia would invest in its own voice. It would stop waiting for cultural permission from elsewhere. He also backed film and cultural initiatives that helped set the stage for what would become the Australian film revival in the 1970s. Again, it sounds soft until you picture it. A nation that had spent decades consuming other people's stories beginning to finance its own. That's not decoration, that's identity. And then there was science and technology, another Gorton obsession. He believed national strength wasn't just troops and treaties. It was research, industry, the ability to make and innovate. His government supported major national projects and institutions, and he spoke about them with a kind of impatient conviction that made some colleagues uncomfortable. They wanted politics to be management. He wanted it to be construction. But the most dramatic arena of his prime ministership, the one that still throws sparks, was foreign policy and the slow, deliberate loosening of Australia's old imperial reflexes. Gorton's Australia was still allied tightly with the United States, still committed to ANZUS, still shaped by Cold War logic, yet he pushed the idea that Australia should not be merely an echo. He moved to strengthen ties in the region and to think of Australia as a Pacific nation with its own interests, not just a distant outpost of the West. And he supported steps that nudged Australia away from automatic British alignment, symbolic and practical shifts that, over time, changed how Australians imagined their place in the world. And while all of that was happening, he was also trying to manage the domestic tremors, the economy, the social changes, the growing impatience with long-term conservative rule. The 1969 election had already shown the coalition bleeding support. By the early 1970s, the sense of inevitability was gone. The government no longer felt like the natural state of things. It felt like a regime that could end. Gorton, watching from the back bench after resigning defense, could see the cliff edge. He had been inside the cockpit when the instruments started to fail. He knew what it looked like when a government loses the confidence of its own story. In 1972, the cliff arrived. The election that year ended 23 years of coalition rule. Gough Whitlam and the Labour Party won, and the country pivoted with a speed that made the old era look suddenly antique. For many liberals, it was a trauma. For Gorton, it was complicated. He was a liberal, yes, but he had never been a comfortable prisoner of liberal orthodoxy. He had been fighting his own side for years over what Australia should dare to become. Now, with the coalition out of power, the internal liberal wars intensified. The party had to decide what it was. Was it the party of cautious management, or could it be something more national, more modern, more willing to build? Gorton's presence in that debate was like a splinter you couldn't remove. Painful, persistent, impossible to ignore. He didn't always vote the way the party expected. He didn't always speak the way the party wanted. And in politics, that kind of independence is treated like a contagious disease. Parties survive by discipline. Gorton survived by refusing to pretend. The tension reached its most dramatic point in 1975 during one of the most explosive constitutional crises in Australian history. The Whitlam government was being strangled in the Senate, supply was blocked, and the country was sliding toward a showdown that would end with the Governor-General dismissing an elected prime minister. In that atmosphere, every vote, every stance, every public word carried the weight of legitimacy. Gorton, the former Liberal prime minister, did something that stunned many on his side. He crossed the floor in Parliament, not on a minor technicality, not on a harmless conscience vote, but in the middle of a national crisis. He voted against his own party's line. To understand how shocking that was, you have to picture the scene. The chamber isn't just a room, it's a theater of loyalty. Crossing the floor is a public act of betrayal in the eyes of party enforcers. It's a man standing up and saying, in front of cameras and colleagues, "I will not be owned." For Gorton, it was consistent. For the party machine, it was unforgivable. The consequences were immediate. His relationship with the Liberal Party, already strained, began to break in a way that couldn't be repaired with private meetings or polite statements. He had become, in the eyes of many colleagues, not merely difficult, but dangerous, because he demonstrated that a liberal could defy the tribe and survive. And yet, to a certain kind of Australian, that was exactly what made him compelling. Not because he was always right, not because he was always graceful. He wasn't. But because he acted like he believed Parliament was more than a scoreboard for party numbers. He acted like it was a place where a man could still choose. By the mid-1970s, the clock that had been ticking since Holt's disappearance had transformed again. It was no longer the clock of legitimacy or the clock of leadership survival. It was the clock of relevance. How long could Gorton remain inside a party that increasingly treated him as an embarrassment? How long before he either conformed or walked away? He chose the third option. He broke. In 1975, after years of friction, he resigned from the Liberal Party and declared himself an independent. It was a political severing that carried a personal sting. This was the party he had led, the party that had lifted him to the highest office, the party that had then turned on him. Now he was cutting the cord completely, stepping into the lonely space where you have no machine behind you, only your name, your record, and your nerve. As an independent, he kept speaking with the same bluntness that had made him both magnetic and infuriating. He wasn't trying to climb again. He wasn't building a faction. He was, in a sense, doing what he had always done, refusing to be shaped into something smaller. By 1981, after decades in federal politics, he left Parliament. No triumphant farewell tour. No carefully staged coronation of a successor. He simply stepped out of the arena that had chewed him up and, in its own way, never quite digested him. But the story doesn't end with his exit. Because the most unsettling thing about John Gorton is that his contradictions don't resolve neatly. He was a conservative who expanded the role of the Commonwealth in national development. A party man who repeatedly defied party discipline. A war hero who carried the impatience of combat into committee rooms. A prime minister who tried to make Australia more independent and was punished by colleagues who feared the cost of that independence. And as the years moved on, the country he had argued for, more self-confident, more culturally assertive, less automatically deferential, kept arriving anyway, piece by piece, under leaders who often received credit for changes Gorton had pushed when they were still controversial. He had been fighting for a version of Australia that his own side wasn't ready to admit it wanted. And that is the cruelest kind of political fate. To be right too early, loud enough to be noticed, and stubborn enough to be punished for it. You can lose an election and still keep your name. You can lose a party and still keep your seat. But there's one loss that strips a politician down to the bone. The moment the country moves on without you, and you're forced to watch. Your own ideas become normal, spoken in calmer voices by people who never paid the price you paid. John Gorton walked out of Parliament in 1981 and into that exact silence. He was not an old man then, not in the way Australians imagine political retirement. He was 69, an age when many leaders are still sharpening knives, still collecting numbers, still dreaming of one more comeback. But Gorton didn't have the temperament for a gentle fade-out, and he didn't have the time for a long goodbye. The clock that had chased him since the war, since the cockpit, since the crash, since the scars, had changed again. Now it was the clock of the body, the clock of stamina, the clock that doesn't care what you used to be. Outside the house, the world didn't slow down to match his pace. Canberra kept humming. New faces filled the chamber. The Liberal Party, which he had once led, continued without him as if he were a strange weather event from another decade. Violent, memorable, and safely past. And yet for Gorton, retirement wasn't a soft chair in a quiet garden. It was a new kind of fight. To remain himself when the arena that had defined him was gone. He returned to a more private life. But private never meant invisible. He had a presence that didn't evaporate. The battered warrior look, the blunt voice, the refusal to varnish a sentence. People still wanted him in rooms, on panels, at dinners, sauna and at events where the past is invited to sit at the table and behave, and that was the problem. Gorton could do many things, but he could not behave on command. He took on roles that kept him close to the national bloodstream. Boards, committees, public causes, work that suited his belief that a country is built, not merely administered. He had always been drawn to the machinery of nationhood. Science, industry, culture, the institutions that outlast elections. In retirement, he could support those things without cabinet colleagues watching for disloyalty, without party whips counting his steps. It should have felt like freedom, but freedom has its own cost. In politics, even your enemies give you a shape. Outside it, you have to hold your own shape alone. And then there was the personal terrain he could never fully escape. The story of his prime ministership still argued over like an old wound. Some remembered him as the man who tried to pull Australia into a more independent posture, less reflexively British, more confident in its own voice. Others remembered the chaos, the internal feuds, the sense that he was always one argument away from detonating his own support. The truth, as always, was messier and more human. He had been a builder trapped inside a party that often preferred caretakers. He had been a nationalist inside a conservative machine that feared nationalism when it required spending money, taking risks, or offending comfortable allies. In the years after he left Parliament, the country kept changing in ways that made his earlier battles look strangely prophetic. Australian cultural confidence grew. The arts became less of a punchline and more of a national industry. Film and television told Australian stories with fewer apologies. Science and research became political talking points. The idea that Australia should think of itself as a regional power in the Asia-Pacific, rather than a distant echo of Britain, became mainstream. And every time those ideas were spoken as common sense, there was an unspoken shadow behind them. Gorton had argued for this when it was still dangerous to say out loud in his own party room. That's the twist that haunts his legacy. He didn't lose because his ideas were wrong. He lost because his timing was wrong, and because he delivered those ideas with a personality that made compromise feel like surrender. Yet even as his reputation slowly shifted, his private life carried its own weight. Politics had never been kind to his marriage, and his marriage had never been a simple footnote. Bettina Gorton had been beside him through the brutal years, through the leadership tensions, the public scrutiny, the endless nights. When a man comes home physically present but mentally still in the chamber, their relationship endured, but it bore the marks of a life lived under pressure. Retirement didn't magically repair what politics had strained. It simply removed the noise so the strain could be heard. And then, as the decades turned, the body began collecting its debts. The war had left him with scars you could see, but also with damage you couldn't. He had survived crashes in combat, survived the kind of fear that rewires a person's nervous system. He had carried that survival into politics, where the threats are quieter but constant. Betrayal, humiliation, the slow erosion of trust. By the 1990s, the physical decline was no longer something he could out-stubborn. Age narrowed his world. The man who once seemed carved from granite began to look at times like a man made of paper, still sharp-eyed, still capable of a cutting remark, but increasingly fragile. And yet he remained in conversation and in memory, difficult to domesticate. He could still surprise people. He could still say something that made a room go still, because it was too honest, too blunt, too unhelpful to the polite story everyone wanted to tell. Australia likes its former prime ministers softened by time, turned into ceremonial figures who smile for photographs and speak in safe generalities. Gorton never fully became that. Even when he was physically diminished, the core of him resisted being turned into a museum piece. There were moments late in life when the country seemed to look back at him with a different expression. Less irritation, more curiosity. Historians and journalists revisited his years in office and found something more complicated than the old caricatures. They saw a leader who had pushed Commonwealth involvement in areas conservatives often avoided: the arts, national development, science. The idea of Australia as a self-defining nation. They saw a man who had tried to modernize the Liberal Party from within and had been punished for it. They saw, too, the flaws, the impulsiveness, the sometimes chaotic management, the way he could turn allies into enemies with a sentence that landed like a slap. But even that reassessment carried a sting, because recognition, arriving late, is not the same as victory. It doesn't give you back the years. It doesn't undo the nights when you realize the room has turned against you. It doesn't erase the humiliation of being replaced by men you believed were smaller than the job. And Gorton had always been a man who felt things intensely, even when he pretended not to. As he approached the end, the time limit became unmistakable. Not the political deadline of an election, not the parliamentary deadline of a vote, but the final deadline that makes every other deadline look theatrical. He had outlived many of his contemporaries. He had watched Australia move from the post-war world into something unrecognizable from the country of his youth. He had watched the monarchy debates, the cultural shifts, the changing alliances, the new anxieties. He had watched the nation become more itself. On 19th of August 2002, John Gorton died, 90 years old. A life that began in the era of empire and ended in a country that spoke with a far more independent voice than the one he had inherited. And then came the strange afterlife that only politics can offer. The arguments, the tributes, the selective memories. Some praised his courage and his independence. Some remembered the turbulence. Some spoke of him as a transitional figure, an awkward bridge between old Australia and new. But that word, transitional, can be a polite way of saying unfinished, and Gorton's story was never about neat completion. If you want to understand what he leaves behind, don't look for a single monument with his name carved into it. Look instead for the things that became normal. A federal government that treats culture as part of national strength, not a decorative extra. A country that funds its own stories and expects them to matter. A political language that assumes Australia can act in its own interest, not merely as an appendage of someone else's power. A sense, still contested, still imperfect, that nationhood is something you build deliberately. Gorton didn't invent those ideas and he didn't get to own them. But he pushed them forward when it cost him. He forced them into rooms that didn't want to hear them. He made them harder to ignore. And that may be the most Gorton-like legacy imaginable. Not a comfortable triumph, not a clean moral, but a stubborn imprint. The mark of a man who refused to be managed by party, by fashion, by expectation, until time itself finally managed him. In the end, the scars on his face were the least dramatic evidence of what he'd survived. The real scars were political, personal, and invisible. The price of trying to drag a cautious system toward a bolder idea of Australia. While the system fought back with smiles, whispers, and numbers, he once flew through anti-aircraft fire with seconds to decide whether he lived or died. Later, he walked into party rooms where the fire was quieter, but just as lethal to a career. He survived both, but only one of them let him keep the cockpit. And if you listen closely to modern Australia, confident in its own culture, impatient with deference, still arguing about what independence really costs, you can hear an echo of that stubborn pilot-turned prime minister still refusing to be erased.